Welcome back, everyone, to another deep dive. Today, we're going to try to unpack a topic that's incredibly timely and a bit controversial.
It really is.
NATO expansion and its implications for what's happening in Ukraine.
Big issue.
Yeah. We're going to be looking at an opinion piece from the American Conservative.
Right.
It's titled, "For Peace in Ukraine, Stop NATO Expansion."
Right.
Published pretty recently, December 19th, 2024.
Very recent.
Yeah, so it's right on the on the front burner, and the author of this piece, well, we won't say their name, but makes a pretty strong argument against continued expansion
They do.
of NATO, and really kind of lays a lot of the blame at the feet of both the West and Putin.
They really do. I mean, they come out and say that both the West and Putin share blame for the conflict.
Yeah, and that's a pretty bold statement, I think.
Yeah.
To come out and kind of put it right out there like that.
Yeah, and they go back into the history of NATO expansion, and they say that really the seeds of this conflict were sown after the Cold War. When the West essentially went back on promises to limit NATO's eastward expansion.
So this is not just about what's happening right now in Ukraine.
No, it's not.
This goes back much further.
It goes back to the the fall of the Soviet Union and the promises that were made or allegedly made to Russia
and broken. And they cite a pretty big name in this whole idea of broken promises.
Yeah, they mentioned William Burns, who is currently the CIA director.
Right.
But way back when he was ambassador to Russia, even then he was sounding the alarm about the potential consequences of NATO expansion.
Yeah.
So that's pretty significant.
That's a pretty big voice to have on your side, I guess.
Yeah, you would think so. You would think so.
To make that point. So let's shift gears a little bit and talk about where things stand now. What's the author's take on Zelensky's victory plan and his push for immediate NATO membership?
So Zelensky's proposal is a two-pronged approach. He wants the areas of Ukraine currently under Kyiv's control to gain immediate NATO membership. And of course, with that comes the security guarantee. So
the mutual defense.
All of the NATO members will defend each other if attacked.
Wow.
So he's looking for that protection now with the aim of eventually reclaiming the Russian-occupied territories later.
So a very kind of bold strategy.
Very bold, to say the least.
Yeah, especially considering that early on he was, adamantly against peace talks.
He banned peace talks with Russia.
Yeah.
Early in the conflict.
Yeah, interesting. So this author, though, sees some real problems with this approach.
They do.
And I'm guessing they're not alone in this.
They're not alone at all. And in fact, they point to a number of different voices who are echoing these calls for NATO expansion. They say that there's kind of a chorus of hawks in Europe who are really pushing this.
Give me some examples.
So they mentioned Lithuania's defense minister, Laurynas Kasčiūnas, who is absolutely adamant against giving Russia any say in who joins NATO. And then you have Estonia's foreign minister, Margus Tsahkna, who's pushing for either full NATO membership for Ukraine or, at the very least, very strong security guarantees from the West.
Okay, so some pretty strong voices coming out of some European countries. But what about, bigger players? Like, what about Germany? Where do they stand on all this?
Well, the author does cite Germany's foreign minister, Annalena Baerbock, who sees NATO inclusion for Ukraine as a path towards peace.
Okay.
The caveat here, though, is that Germany's military, despite all their economic power, is not really in a position to be taking on a major conflict.
Right.
So the article kind of highlights the irony of it. These smaller states, Lithuania and Estonia, with their limited military capabilities, being the loudest voices advocating for a policy that would ultimately rely on American military might if things were to escalate.
Right.
So it's kind of like they're pushing for a fight, but expecting someone else to do the heavy lifting.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. So we've got Zelensky pushing for NATO. We've got support from European leaders. And then we've got this author who's clearly sounding the alarm bells.
Right.
But what exactly is their core argument here? Why are they so against bringing Ukraine into NATO?
Well, they come right out and say it. They say America needs to put its own security interests first.
Yeah.
And getting tangled up in alliances that could drag the U.S. into unnecessary conflicts, especially one with the potential for nuclear escalation, is a dangerous game.
And they're pretty blunt about Ukraine. They say that it's simply not worth risking American lives, especially given the possibility of things going nuclear, which is a pretty stark contrast to the position of some pretty influential groups in Washington.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, the author calls out organizations like the Atlantic Council and the George W. Bush Presidential Center.
Okay.
Who seem very willing to risk a lot, maybe even everything, when it comes to supporting Ukraine. So they highlight this disconnect between these institutions, which they see as part of the Washington elite, and everyday Americans who, polling shows very little appetite for a war with Russia, especially one with the potential for nuclear consequences.
So the author is basically saying, wake up, America. This isn't our fight, which is a pretty controversial statement.
Very controversial.
And I'm sure a lot of people would push back against that. So what about all the arguments in favor of bringing Ukraine into NATO? How does the author address those?
Well, this is where the author really gets into the weeds and kind of tries to dismantle point by point some of the most common arguments for Ukrainian NATO membership.
All right, so let's get into those weeds. What's the first argument they tackle?
Well, they start by addressing the emotional argument. The fact that many Ukrainians desperately want the security guarantees that come with being a member of NATO.
Yeah.
And the author doesn't deny that desire for protection.
Right.
But they say it's simply not relevant to America's core security interests.
So they're acknowledging that human element there, but they're saying, ultimately, U.S. policy can't be driven by sentiment.
Exactly, yeah. And then they move on to this whole idea that, we're on the brink of World War III because of what's happening in Ukraine.
Yeah.
Which they basically call hyperbole.
Mm-hmm.
They point to America's long history of supporting regimes that weren't exactly, beacons of democracy.
Okay, so they're pushing back against this sense of impending doom that we sometimes hear.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
And then they make a really interesting point about Russia's motivations.
Okay, I'm curious to hear this. What's the author's take on what Putin is really after?
They argue that Russia poses no direct threat to the United States, at least for now.
Okay.
And that their actions are primarily defensive, focused on preventing NATO expansion.
Okay.
Not on some grand plan to rebuild a Russian empire or, to conquer Europe or anything like that.
So that's a different narrative than we sometimes hear, right?
It is, yeah.
Yeah.
And this leads to their argument against the claim that NATO membership would somehow make a ceasefire more likely.
So the conventional wisdom is that NATO would deter Russia
Right.
and create the conditions for peace, but this author is saying no.
They're saying the opposite. They're saying it would actually encourage Russia to escalate the conflict.
Wow.
Make things even more dangerous.
So that's a pretty bold statement. What's the logic behind that?
Well, their argument is that Russia sees NATO expansion as an existential threat.
Okay.
So if Ukraine were to join, it would be seen as crossing a red line.
Right.
And Russia might feel compelled to respond with force. It's kind of a security dilemma situation.
Right, where one side's attempt to make themselves more secure actually makes the other side.
Exactly. And leads to a spiral of escalation.
So instead of deterring conflict, NATO expansion could actually provoke it.
That's their argument, yeah. And it kind of ties into another argument they make, which is that expanding NATO would deter Russian aggression against other European nations.
Right, so the logic there is if Russia sees that NATO is strong and willing to defend its member, then they'll be less likely to mess with any of them, right?
Right. But the author points out that most of Russia's neighbors are already NATO members.
Right.
So if they were really hell-bent on aggression, they'd already be at war.
That's a good point. So if deterring Russia isn't really the main goal here, then what is it?
Well, they challenge this idea that NATO membership would be a more cost-effective way to protect Ukraine than continuing to provide financial aid and military support.
I can see the logic there, right? Like it's cheaper to just have them under the NATO umbrella than to have to constantly be funding their defense independently.
Right, exactly. But they call this line of thinking illogical and dangerous. They argue that risking a potential nuclear conflict to save some money on aid is a recipe for disaster.
So basically putting a price tag on peace, especially when nuclear weapons are involved,
Is a bad idea.
yeah, is a fool's errand.
It's a fool's errand. And then they kind of go beyond these specific arguments.
Yep.
And they take aim at this notion that offering Ukraine NATO membership would be this grand gesture of Western resolve.
Yeah, so the thinking there is that it sends a strong signal to Putin, like, hey, the West is united, we're standing firm.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
But they argue that it would actually signal weakness
Oh, okay.
because it shows that the West is willing to make promises it can't or won't keep.
Interesting. And this whole idea that, Russia is on this mission to rebuild a lost empire, what's the author's perspective on that?
They basically dismantle this whole idea too.
Okay.
They point out that Putin himself has rejected any such ambitions. They argue that Russia's actions are driven by a desire for security, not by, dreams of imperial conquest.
So we've covered a lot of ground here. The author has presented a pretty scathing critique of the pro-NATO expansion arguments.
Yeah.
What's the main takeaway here for our listeners?
I think the main takeaway is that the author is making a really strong case that NATO expansion is a dangerous policy that could draw the U.S. into a catastrophic war over a country that doesn't directly impact American security.
So the risks far outweigh any potential benefits.
Right.
But that leaves us with a pretty big question. If NATO expansion is off the table, what other options are there for resolving this conflict?
That is the million-dollar question, and a really tough one to answer. There are no easy answers here, but the author does hint at some alternative approaches that might be worth considering.
Well, let's consider those then. What kind of solutions are we talking about here?
Well, they talk about, instead of focusing on military solutions, and expansion, they say we need to shift gears and prioritize diplomacy and de-escalation.
Okay.
And they argue that doubling down on this idea of NATO expansion is only going to make things worse.
Right. Make it harder to actually reach some kind of peace.
Exactly. Yeah. Make a peaceful resolution even more elusive.
Yeah.
They don't lay out any concrete plans, but they encourage a broader conversation about alternative paths to peace.
Okay, so if NATO expansion is not the answer, what are some of those alternative paths? What does a more peaceful approach look like?
Well, one idea that's been floated around is this concept of neutrality for Ukraine.
Okay.
Something similar to what Austria adopted during the Cold War.
Right.
So essentially, Ukraine wouldn't join NATO.
Okay.
But they would receive security guarantees from both Russia and the West.
So creating a buffer zone.
Right, exactly.
That could kind of ease concerns on both sides.
Right. It's a delicate balancing act, but it could potentially address Russia's fears of, NATO encroachment while also giving Ukraine, some degree of autonomy and protection.
That would require a huge amount of trust from all parties involved, right? And how do you actually guarantee those security guarantees? I mean, what's to stop?
Right. How do you enforce that?
Exactly, yeah.
And that's not even, addressing the issue of the territories that Russia currently occupies. So, what do you do about that?
Yeah. So there are still there's
some major
thorny issues to work out, for sure.
Yeah.
It sounds like it's going to take a lot of creativity.
A lot.
Compromise and a willingness to
think outside the box.
Yeah, to really move beyond the current kind of stalemate.
Exactly. And that's really what the author is calling for.
Right.
It's about thinking outside the box, exploring options that prioritize de-escalation and dialogue over military solutions.
And, this whole conversation really ties back to something we talk about a lot on the show, which is the dangers of groupthink, right? Especially when it comes to foreign policy.
It's so easy to get swept up in the prevailing narrative.
Right.
To just accept certain assumptions without really questioning them.
And this deep dive has really shown us that there are alternative perspectives out there.
There really are.
That deserve to be heard, even if they challenge the status quo.
Even if they made people uncomfortable.
Right.
Yeah.
It's like everyone's looking at the same map, but drawing different conclusions about which path to take.
And sometimes those dissenting voices, those who are willing to challenge conventional wisdom, those are the ones that can help us see things more clearly.
Help us avoid making those really big, costly mistakes.
Exactly.
Because, at the end of the day, the stakes are incredibly high. We're talking about war and peace.
Yep.
We're talking about, a conflict that could have devastating consequences for the entire world.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So it's more important than ever to really think critically about these issues.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I think we want to leave our listeners with a challenge.
Yeah.
Don't just take our word for it.
Please.
Don't just accept what you hear from, politicians or pundits or, whoever.
The so-called experts.
Yeah. Do your own research.
Absolutely.
Seek out those diverse perspectives.
Yeah.
Form your own conclusions.
Because the more informed we are as citizens, the better equipped we'll be to navigate these really complex challenges and advocate for policies that promote a more peaceful and just world.
That's what we're all about here.
That's it.
So thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
Appreciate it.
And we'll see you next time.